I just want to say welcome to everybody who's joined us. And thank you for coming today. We have such interesting topics, and you know our main topic is the roadmap to return to the workplace. We'll also be having our guest speaker, who Brennan will talk about and introduce. But it is my honor to get to introduce Brennan, who is the founder of Bright Talent. And of course, Bright Talent is the resource for strategic HR people, helping HR teams and business leaders solve people challenges. And I'll turn it over to you now, Brennan.
All right. Well, MJ, hold on one sec. I will talk. Well, we love technology. And so right now my technology is frozen, but I think you can hear me, right? I'm relying on you, Mickey Joe, and your head gestures. Okay. So while I figure this out, I'll just quickly have to stop sharing. And then I will share my screen once more so that this properly sets up. Really appreciate everybody coming out today to the webinar. Just want to give you some context. We, probably about 6 weeks ago, maybe 5 weeks ago, when we started hearing dates get mentioned in terms of returning to the workplace, my team and I, we realized as HR operations people, hey, this is an opportunity for us to give back to our community, because more or less this is a change management project, because it is likely our return to the workplace is going to be very different from how we left the workplace. And so that's going to require some tools to get organized, to prepare and plan to bring the workforce back. So hence we decided to create a change management plan, which really is a workforce plan, which is to help our community of HR leaders and business owners to more or less think through all the necessary things that need to be thought through to get organized and safely and in a very efficient way and an effective way bring the workforce back. So we developed this roadmap to the workplace, return to the workplace workforce plan, and then that's what I'm going to jump in. And so we will have a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to walk through, and then we will get into the tools that we developed for you so we can show you how to use them. And then we're going to reserve roughly about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So it allows you to ask us about any of the tools or the plans or anything that we're hearing that people are doing. And then I'm really excited to have John Polson of Phillips join us and talk about the interesting scenario we find ourselves in as employers of now conducting health checks as part of the safety of our workforce being in the workplace. So it puts us in a little different position that we're all accustomed to. And so John has a unique perspective, obviously working with many clients, as to what we should be doing or should be considering. So we'll get into that during the Q&A. So I'm going to switch back to my PowerPoint, and then we will jump in to the program. So one second. I'm having glitches. There we go. So real quickly about the agenda, I'm going to just for 10 seconds talk about us, then want to cover some assumptions that I think we all need to make as we go in and prepare and plan. And then we'll talk about how to plan. We're going to talk about the tools so that you can collaborate with your peers in terms of other business leaders inside your company. And then we'll jump into the Q&A. So a little bit about us. We are a boutique HR consulting company. We provide responsive and resourceful experts in HR, project management training, and recruiting. We are a company that lives by our values, and I always like to reiterate these. We live by our values of honest solutions. We do what's right. We're resourceful, accountable, and we're focused on our community. And hence, that's what this entire program is about, is to give back to this community that is so generously given to us through the 10 years that we've been in business. So we just feel it's an honor that you're here with us and we can share this information with you. So in terms of the roadmap to return to the workplace, we're going to cover some assumptions based on today's data, as Mickey Jo was saying at the beginning during our conversation, we are learning how to learn quickly again. As I like to say, I feel like I'm studying for a college exam, and then I come in the next day and the material's changed. And so it's one of these things, if you are thirsty for knowledge, this is a time for you. And then also, we're going to talk about how the project plan, how we need to plan, and then how we need to collaborate. And then really importantly, we have some decision workflows and how to segment the workforce in terms of thinking about them as they come back to the workplace, who's staying remote, who's coming back to the workplace, and then what to do in those cases. What we're not going to cover today, at least in this presentation, is any of the LOA, any emergency acts, any compliance-related issues, or employment law for that matter, except for when we get to the end with John Polson. So this is really more around operations and strategy. And I see Mickey Jo popping in because I know there's a couple of things I might have forgot to mention. Mickey Jo, what did I forget to mention at the top of the presentation?
Just wanted to cover a couple of logistics that we're not using chat today, but what we are using is the Q&A. So most of you are familiar with Zoom, and at the bottom you'll see the Q&A little icon. When you have questions, if you can just put them in the Q&A, that's where we'll be looking. And we're going to save the questions until after the main presentation, answer a few questions, then I'll be listening to John and his contribution, and then if you have more questions after that, we'll answer them. So that's kind of the Q&A flow. And feel free to put whatever your questions and thoughts are in the Q&A, and we'll get to it. Okay, thanks, Brennan. Go ahead.
Great, thank you for that. And I forgot to mention that, you know, I'm more or less the speaker. However, behind the scenes on our team, we have Renee Maurer and Amy Watts, and then of course Mickey Jo. They really are the ones that pull this together. So I need to mention and say thank you to them for making this happen every week. So let's work on a couple of assumptions. The return to the workplace is already here for many. I know a lot of companies were considered essential. They never stopped working, so they had a bit of a mix of production or whatever staff still working, and then they had a mix of be able to work remotely. And now they're going through the phase of who's coming back and who's not. And so the date to come back, we were saying, was arbitrarily May. And now what we're hearing really is people are starting to open up. And so the assumption is made at June, we're going to work through this process. My recommendation to you would be to not rush into this, if you can, to take your time. And so if it pushes into June, so be it. You want to make sure it doesn't have to be perfect. And what we're saying around here at Bright Talent, it's better to be crude and effective versus polished and perfect. You don't have time right now to be polished and perfect, but you do have time to be crude and effective, meaning you're just putting things together with the idea that you're going to continue to evolve those tools. And the most important thing you need to do is there's so much information out there in the news and such. The areas you need to go to are your local health agencies for the up-to-date guidance, because what's happening on a national level and even at a state level is not necessarily correlate to what's happening on a county and a city level. So that's really important that you do reference those, and we give you some of those resources later. And so to prepare for the new workplace, we really need to think of this way. The pandemic will end, but we don't know when, and we don't know when it'll return. If we were to look at 1918, I just happened to be reading this information, we had 3 phases of the 1918 Spanish flu. It hit the first phase, second phase, and then a third phase. It eventually was over in about a year altogether. So it's one of these things that we need to be planful, and whatever we're putting in place now could be seen as temporary. However, a lot of these fixes could be permanent. So we'll just see as this evolves. Obviously, it's exposed gaps in our workforce plans where some of us are working remotely and we have no remote workforce policy. So those types of things that we now need to jump up and put together. And then it's also a time, to, again, to plan for the new reality, because whatever we're doing now could become permanent, even though it might be temporary. So again, crude and effective now, perfect and polished later. And so here's some other assumptions that we need to consider as we build this return to workplace. So first of all, distancing restrictions. That means if we continue to have the distancing restrictions in place, meaning no more than 10 or 20, depending on where you're at, people in a given place, we now have to look at our office that way and understand what areas that we're operating with many people in them, how are we going to change that, and then where do the people go? And then gathering restrictions in terms of, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. So distancing restrictions, the space apart, and then gathering restrictions, how many people can be in a place at once. And so a lot of, manufacturing and production, we had shifts of people come into work. We've never really thought of that from a professional point of view. So that's something we might need to consider on a temporary basis. We have to think about employee health restrictions, those that are 65 plus, potentially immune compromised. We have to think about employee health screening. We're looking for any symptoms they might have as they come into the workforce, and we have the authority, which John Polson will talk about a little bit later, to actually send these people home if we are feeling they have symptoms that look like COVID-19. And then infection prevention measures as it relates to sanitation and an infectious disease response plan, so that what if somebody tests positive in the office for COVID-19, what do we do? And then again, working on those remote workforce policies. So when we talk about the change management plan and we talk about the workforce plan, to be organized, you have to build a project plan. So you have to really get organized in terms of how you think about your workforce coming back. And so we're going to cover the project plan is built around these 6 areas: policy, communication, function, systems, facilities, and ongoing, right? We have to think about this ongoing in terms of how is it working? Is it efficient? Is it giving us what we need? And just evolve with it. And so in terms of the project plan, you will see this is available for download on our website at the pandemic support page. And we built this in MS Project. And for those of you that might be looking on a mobile device, I apologize because this is small. This is available for download, as I mentioned. And so perhaps you can download that quickly and look at it in a larger scale so that you can follow along. So if you understand MS Project, it works a little bit like Excel in that you have your primary tasks and then you have your subtasks underneath, and then you can minimize and maximize all those tasks so that you can look at it. So I'm going to walk you through this project plan through those 6 categories as mentioned, and I'll explain each of these. I'm going to do it somewhat quickly because I got off to a little bit slower start in the beginning. And then we will move into the workflows, and then we'll move into the outline. And so I'm going to turn on my pointer here, but when we look at the project plan and we look at policies, you'll see that, first of all, many of us don't have a return to workplace policy. We have a return to work policy, but probably don't have a return to workplace policy. So this is critical in working with the other department heads, such as IT, facilities, environmental health and safety, finance, in terms of developing the workplace policy, who is coming back, and then we need to look at the local guidelines as to how we're going to organize those employees by category coming back. And then more than likely, you do have a return to work policy, but we're going to have to go through and update that policy as well to add or just simply have an addendum, the return to workplace policy, so that it's all aligned and it's not disjointed, again, perhaps on a temporary basis or perhaps on a permanent basis. So again, you're going to want to look at your policies first, and then simultaneously, you will want to look at your communication. Excuse me, your communications plan. So when we talk about a communications plan, we're talking about actually organizing how you're going to communicate to your employee base. You're going to figure out who your employee base is. Most of us know who this is, but then also by audience. So it's highly likely there are messages for all employees, and then there's going to be messages perhaps by location, by department type, by function. As mentioned, some might be still able to work remotely, some might be having to come back to work, and so these different messages need to be crafted for these different employee audiences, we're calling them. So you'll need to develop a communication plan. You'll need to develop timing around that in terms of how often you are communicating with your employees. I know companies like WD-40 committed to communicating once every 2 weeks, if not sooner, with all employees, just to keep them apprised of what is happening. And so as you start this plan, one of your first communications to your employee base might be that you are now putting this plan in place. So they're informed, so they know that you are organizing. I think that's one of the challenges we have seen as we've consistently talked with others is either lack of information or perception. So people will make perceptions based upon the information they have or lack of. And so it's really important as employers to give them the information they need so that they're not left wondering. And also give them a channel to talk to, whether it's your managers or HR, so that they have a resource to go to for the information. And so I didn't walk through every subtask here, but however, this walks you through more or less what I just shared in terms of developing that plan, developing the messages, and how often you're going to communicate with them. And that's essential to give that to your employees, and that's essential to this project plan. Then we move down another subtask here to functions and departments. So after you've had a chance to draft the policies, after you've had a chance to draft the communications, then you're going to be working with each department head and collaborating with them to understand what do the employees need in terms of each department and function. And then you're going to be building a plan according to that. And in that plan, then we move to the next one, is going to be systems. So what kind of systems do they need? If they're working remotely, I know many of us went and started working remotely and yet weren't necessarily set up to do so. So do we have all the systems in place? Do we have the necessary private networks to maintain security? And so these are the types of things by department we will need to put in place. The other thing you need to think about is if we start hoteling or bringing people back to the office part-time, where are they going to sit? What systems access do they need? How are we going to protect that space so that if people are sharing that space, how are we protecting that space? So that's the kind of thought that needs to go into this. And that leads us to facilities. So now clicking on this other subtask, facilities is obviously a critical one because we're going to have to literally look at our offices and potentially make some changes. And so when we say facilities, we need to look at each one by location and then understand by department what the needs are and any workspace adjustments. And what's important is, and we had the CEO of Casco Contractors, who's a tenant improvement construction company, talk about moving your space around. You just need to remember that there's still ADA and requirements and things you have to abide by. So as you move your space around, it's not just simply for distancing, it's still within the requirements of a normal office space guidance. So just don't forget that as you're doing that. But you're going to have to build that plan around what to do for each facility. And this also includes like break rooms, kitchens, bathrooms, restricting the amount of people that can go there. What is the sanitation guidelines for wiping off the fridge door after you use the fridge door to put your food in? So all these details and instructions will have to be built out and provided to your employee base. So you will work through updating or developing and updating your workforce plan as it relates to facilities. And then you will go into ongoing, in terms of ongoing review. So you want to review this at least every 30 days to make sure it's working. You'll be surveying your employees to learn from them in terms of how it's working as well. So that's what we've built out for you in terms of a fairly thorough way to look at building that workforce plan in this project plan document. Now, in support of that, we need to think about our workforce. So we need to understand at a macro level, what are we doing with our workforce by department? And then at a micro level, what are we doing with the individual employees? And so we've built out these workflows to help you. And again, this is small to look at if you're looking at it on a mobile device. These are free to download on our website. But when we look at this at the macro level, I will walk you through this so that it's clear to you in terms of the level of thought and the organization of thought, I should say, the organization of thought as we think about our function and department and what to do with the employees. And so when we look at the functional level, the first decision we have to make is, are they returning to the workplace? And if we say no, that means they're still a remote employee. So then we would categorize them as such. And then the next question is, are they on leave or not? Because we do know that people have been sick or are caring for sick family, or it might be difficult for them to work from home because they don't necessarily have the right internet access, or perhaps they're the caregiver or teacher for their kids right now, and it makes it impossible for them, especially if you have young ones, that it makes it really difficult to work from home. We need to understand, are they on leave, and are they part of the leave policy? If not, if they're able to work, then we come down below, then we will need to continue to work in that environment, but at the same time, we're going to have to review our current policy. Does our current remote workplace policy, is it still relevant? Is there one, and is it still relevant? And so we'll need to draft or update the policy. And then once we start working in the policy, share it with the department leads, and then communicate that with your employees, as well as, I always say, ongoing improvements. So you're going to continually be evaluating this policy to make sure it's working for you. So that's the remote employee path. If we come back up to the top again, and we look at the functional workforce, and again, ask the question, return to workplace, and we say, yes, they are returning to the workplace, then they are now deemed a workplace employee. So once again, the next question is that person on leave or not? And so we would need to categorize them as such. If no, then we're going to review and draft the requirements necessary to come back to work and what the workplace needs are. And similar to the steps I just walked you through in that project plan, you will identify all the new requirements for this employee population to come back to the workplace. And so this is a subtask we created for you just to remind you that you would need to draft those requirements. And one tip we gave you down here that was new at the time when we drafted this, it's probably no longer new. Workplace supplies are going to include PPE, so such as masks, gloves, sanitizers, and such. And so that'll be some of the new supplies you will have to be providing, or you should be providing your employees. And let me pause for a second. I got asked a question, what is the issue if we don't provide our employees PPE? And to the best of my knowledge, there is no law you're breaking. However, there is best practice you're breaking and perception. So the risk that you take is that you lose some of your best employees, or you don't attract some of the best workers out there available to hire, because the perception might be that you're not taking your employee safety seriously. And so the PPE requirement or suggestion is something that, one, it obviously is being recommended by the health agency, but two, it's perception that you're taking safety seriously. So my recommendation here to you is that you do offer that. And then once you've reviewed all the draft requirements, you're going to then communicate all the new requirements to your employee population. And then again, once again, you're going to continually evaluate this, and then you'll have this workflow just to make sure that you're keeping up with the workplace requirements and the workforce. And so that's at the functional level. And now we'll look at the employee level, the micro level, the employee level, and we'll start again at the top. They're an employee. Are they able to work? If the answer is no, then we're going to your leave policies. If the answer is yes, then the next question is, are they returning to the workplace? If they are not returning, if they return to the workplace, yes, then we're going to go through the same steps that I just walked you through at the functional level. If they're not returning to the workplace, do they have the ability to work remotely? And if that is a yes, then that's similar to the same workflow that I just walked you through under the functional level. Where it gets, I think, interesting is when they're going to return to the workplace, no, and then if they cannot work remotely, so ability to work remote is no, now we are left with evaluating the employee status. So is that employee in a position, or does that employee have the skills to move into a role that can work remotely? And so if the answer is yes, we're going to retain that person, and we're going to put them in a position where they can work. And if the answer is no, though, that needs to change, this is where we need to figure out what to do with this employee. Is it a long-term leave situation? Is it a disability situation? Is it a termination situation, layoff, furlough? So this is where it gets a bit more serious in our decision making as to what to do with that employee base. And my caution for you all is just be aware that those that are 65 plus or that are immune compromised, we need to be really sensitive to how we're handling that group, because we don't want to find ourselves just inherently discriminating against them because of these risks. So we want to make sure that we are being fair and building practices that maybe perhaps support them, and maybe if it's temporary, on a temporary basis, so that maybe it pushes out 90 days of leave until perhaps the pandemic gets past us, that we can accommodate them. So that I just want to make sure I bring that caution to you. So those are the workflows in terms of your decision points in terms of your employee base by department and by employee. And then the next tool we have is the project plan outline. And this outline is in support of the project plan. And I'm not going to go into detail here. This is for download. But what we did is we took that project plan and the workflows, and we just boiled it down to this outline. So it's something that basically everything I just talked to you about is right here scripted. But then we also embedded the necessary, what we feel are the necessary links to the government agencies and other resources that you need to update your policy, update your practice, learn about better practice in terms of health checks, and those types of things that we're being asked to do now that we weren't necessarily doing before the pandemic. So with that, we're going to turn it over to the Q&A. And Mickey Jo, I always like to share this before we start getting into the Q&A. I'm just going to show you this right here while we're talking and going through the Q&A so that you can see the different agency websites that you should be aware of that ultimately have all the resources you need. I also have SHRM here, so if you're a SHRM member, they've got an amazing amount of data there to help you. We've turned our website into a resource, so you can go to pandemic support. We also have resources for you there. In fact, this webinar will be, all of our webinars are being uploaded so you can watch them again, or if you don't want to watch me, you can fast forward to the end for the Q&A where the real data is. So each week as you come back to this. And then also there's a Casco Back to Work initiative. Casco is the construction company I mentioned before. They've built this website out and it has everything you need to know about your facilities. So it's also a great resource for you. Mickey Jo, you're on mute. There you go.
Thank you. So we do actually have several questions, and I would say they're really perfect for John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Want me to make that introduction?
Yeah, so let's segue into John, and then let's ask him these questions directly.
Great. Okay. So while you unmute him, I will introduce him. So very pleased to have John Polson, partner of Fisher Phillips out of the Irvine office. John also sits on the committee for COVID-19 for Fisher Phillips. John and I have known each other over the years as I've chaired different associations, and John's been kind enough to be our guest to talk on all sorts of employment law matters, and I was just grateful that he agreed to be our guest speaker today. And I had asked him to focus on really us as employers turning into health checkers now, which is something that we're not necessarily accustomed to. You know, what are some of the best practices he's seeing? What are some of the things we should be doing maybe to mitigate some risk of discrimination, or just anything that we are learning on the fly, what to do and what not to do. So with that, I just want to say hello, John. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Brennan, thanks for having me. Great to see you on the screen there for a little bit. It's been a long time.
Thanks.
As Brennan mentioned, I'm with a firm called Fisher Phillips. We're a national labor and employment law firm. And like Brennan, we converted our website into a COVID-19 resource site as well. As Brennan was mentioning, things that may be legal questions along the way, like legally, what do you do with an employee who is vulnerable because they have asthma or COPD or something like that? Questions like that are all answered in our Return to Work FAQ on our website. So obviously, get your practical HR advice and the brilliant plan documents that we just saw from Brennan, but on our website, you can get some legal answers. So Brennan asked me to focus specifically on health checking. So, and I want to give practical advice, which is my reputation for being practical, but this is one of those things where we have to start with a little legal foundation, which should take no more than a couple minutes. So as you may know, yesterday, the governor issued a press release saying the state is ready to go to stage 2 on the California roadmap, and also issued some specific industry guidance. They basically look like wage orders if you're familiar with the wage orders, where industry by industry, there's direction on how to bring employees back to work. And our topic of health checking is covered in those industry guidance documents. So you've got to look there under your industry guidance and see what it says. I can tell you that I believe all the orders say that temperature and/or symptom screening is mandatory. And that's a quote, and/or, temperature and/or symptom screening. So it's not saying temp checking is mandatory, but you have to do some sort of symptom screening. They also specifically say that when conducting health checks, both parties must be wearing a mask, the employee as well as the person doing the health check, which we would have recommended anyway, and a lot more than a mask, frankly, which we'll talk about in a moment. The orders also all say visitors must be checked. So whatever system you put in place for the employees, you'll need something similar for visitors, and something Brennan can definitely help you with. Every single order requires a site-specific plan, and we think that's going to be a pretty big deal. If you're following all the news, you probably also know a couple days ago there was an executive order issued indicating that anyone who is diagnosed with COVID-19 within 14 days of being in the workplace will be presumed to have a workers' comp claim for COVID-19. You can rebut the presumption with evidence, and we're pretty sure that if you don't have a site-specific plan, you will not be rebutting anything. Also, training is required by the orders, and that's something else that you'll want to have done if you intend to try to rebut those types of claims. And by the way, some people won't. Some people will just want them to flow through as workers' comp claims, and there may be a business case for that as well. As you may know, the WCRIB is intending to basically excuse claims from the experience rating process if they're COVID-19 related. So that may affect how you approach that. Then on top of California, there's lots of federal guidance. And this slide that Brendan put on the screen is perfect because the guidance comes from these agencies. Let me just give you a 1-minute synopsis. EEOC, DFVH, which is not on there, but they have their own guidance, and Cal OSHA, all say that temperature checking is okay. It's not discriminatory. Medical questionnaires are okay. Asking specific questions like, why were you absent from work yesterday? Okay. And even COVID-19 testing as a condition of returning to work is okay. There are a lot of caveats to go along with it, like this is only okay during the pandemic. Outside the pandemic, there would be some other rules that you would have to follow to use any of those things. Also caveats, most of those things require a California Consumer Privacy Act acknowledgement to be provided to the employee. If you don't have that, you may get sucked into the class actions that we see starting to get filed or will be filed shortly. And then there are a lot of medical privacy issues that go along with it. So that's a good segue into the practical advice. Let's start with temperature taking. First of all, you need to decide whether you must do it or not. The state's not requiring it, although you may be in a county or a city where it's required. You may also be in an industry where it's required. If it's not required, then you have to decide if you want to do it. And that's a long conversation. There are pros and cons. The cons are primarily everything I'm about to say in terms of how you do it. First of all, you've got to decide who's going to do the temperature checking and train them on how to do it as safely as possible. You'll need to provide them with protective gear that goes way beyond just a surgical mask. I would recommend that they have a face shield and gloves, as well as the face mask. And some employers will give them a gown as well that's just thrown away at the end of their shift doing the work. You also have to maintain social distancing to the extent possible. That means, if at all possible, using a touchless means of taking someone's temperature. The last thing you really want to do is have one employee touching another one in this process because of the risk of spreading an infection or the disease. You've got privacy issues you have to address. You can't have a bunch of people standing around watching someone getting their temperature taken in such a way where they can hear the conversation in particular. If the temperature is high enough to send the person home, right now the standard being used is 100.4, if I recall correctly. That needs to be a private conversation. You need to keep records that are private. You may choose not to keep any records, by the way, of the actual temperature, but if you do, there are a number of guidelines you'll have to follow to keep those records confidential. And then wage and hour considerations. In California, these employees probably, well, I would say, need to be on the clock as they're waiting in line to get their temperature taken and as they're having their temperature taken. And speaking of having them in line, you can imagine what that's going to look like. If you have a lineup and people are standing right next to each other, major social distancing problem. So you'll have to come up with some guidelines to keep them at least 6 feet apart and avoid the queue turning into a situation that's dangerous in and of itself because people are too close to each other and not protected. Along those lines, I'd recommend a consent/policy document. You need to talk to counsel about whether you want to use a consent document or just a policy document, but the employees need to get something in writing, preferably that they sign, giving them the guidelines and how the temperature taking is going to work. This is where you stand. This is how distancing works. Here's the privacy protocols that we have, and so forth. So as you can see, temperature taking is complicated. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It is an outstanding form of prevention and can be used to help defend OSHA claims that you may receive, workers' comp claims that you may receive, and so forth. If you decide not to do temp testing, I would strongly recommend the use of health questionnaires. Particularly on the first day coming back to work, an employee, I would recommend receive a questionnaire where they have to answer basic questions about whether they've been exposed to COVID and do they have symptoms of COVID. Some employers will have those questionnaires completed every day somebody comes to work. It may not be in writing, it may be a click and accept kind of thing if you're using a computer check-in process or clock-in process, or it may be in writing. And how you approach that may depend on your industry. It may depend on the area and how hot it is in terms of COVID cases. But remember, these industry orders talk about using health checks, and that probably means a health check of some kind every day somebody comes to work, even if it's a verbal health check. As a practical matter, trying to wrap up here, and then you can ask questions if you have questions, I really highly recommend getting a good solid document set together for all of these things. We talked about consent documents. I mentioned policy documents, the privacy notice documents, and there ought to be some procedure documents along the lines of what Brennan was talking about, so that when employees come back to work, everybody knows how these things are going to flow. And of course, these health checks are just a tiny little piece of a very big program that needs to include your disinfectant schedule, your cleaning schedules, your what happens if somebody's diagnosed policy, and so forth. This is just one small piece of it. So don't feel like you've got it all covered just with this one thing, obviously. So Brennan, you wanted me to keep it to about 10 minutes for that, so I think I did, and hopefully that leaves us a little time for a couple of questions if those questions are still lingering out there after my crash course on the health check.
Well, thank you.
I was just going to say, those questions and more.
I bet.
Okay. So I think we'll just take one at a time here. See, in regards to temperature checking, if the employee has 100.3 temperature, can they send them home?
Well, you should follow the CDC guidance, which frankly, we all think is going to morph. Medical experts are saying that there are certain parts of this that we may have wrong. Like you may have read that losing the sense of taste now may be a symptom of COVID-19. So that's new. So you just need to follow whatever the guidance is. And if you're sending them home for having a temperature less than the CDC guidance, that could be a potential disability discrimination problem. So that's something that we think about carefully.
And it also sounds like we need to look at updates, if things are going to morph. Let's see, the next question, health questionnaires, can these be sent in the form of electronic survey?
They can be done electronically, and I think that probably is the most popular way to do it. The challenge is maintaining confidentiality and security when it's done that way, and making sure you have your CCPA notices up to date so that they match what you're actually doing with the process.
Who can we work with to decide and find out what questions can and cannot be asked on the health questionnaires?
You probably need a lawyer to help you with that. We have a sample health questionnaire on our website. Actually, I think there might be two of them. One is a basic daily questionnaire that is like, in the last 24 hours, have you had a fever, fatigue, cough, sneezing, and so forth. And then there's one that's more detailed than this one that you would only use on the first day back to work, where they answer some other related questions. Okay. So our website, fisherphillips.com.
Great. What if someone refuses to wear a face mask to work? What are their rights and what are the employer's rights?
Yeah, it's very situational. You really need to have a thoughtful conversation with that person and find out why. The EEOC notes in their guidance, which changes every couple of days, that if they may have a disability reason for not wearing the mask. They may have a physiological reason for not wearing the mask. And that may be something you have to accommodate. But if there's nothing like that, there's no protected status issue with disability or a health condition, then you probably can send them home. But I would run through it with counsel before you make that decision, because the lawsuits are mounting up over things like this quickly.
Okay. May we ask an employee to get tested for COVID-19 before returning to work, especially when they are showing symptoms?
The current guidance says yes. If you look at the EOC guidance, which I think was updated yesterday, their FAQ specifically asks that question, and the answer is yes. And we believe California would go along with that. But in both contexts, though, there's a big caveat that you have to be using accurate tests. And I mean, that's a whole ball of wax all to itself. But just make sure you're using one that is approved by somebody as an accurate form of testing.
Okay. What if someone refuses to come to work if they're required to have a temp check? What rights do they have?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because the health check is required by law at this point, we feel comfortable not bringing that person back to work if they refuse to cooperate. The situational question will be, what is their status at that point? I'm sure a lot of people would say you should let them stay out on some sort of an unpaid leave, or if they have pay coming to them, they can be paid. Some people might say furlough them. Terminating them is a last resort, but you've got to comply with the legal requirements, obviously. So you're in a position where you can force them to go through a lawful health check process.
Okay. And let's see, last question. Is it a bit discriminating to tell someone over 60 they cannot return to the workplace?
Yes. It's a nuanced thing. I refer to the EOC changing their guidance frequently. Well, this is one of the things they've really tinkered with. Earlier in the week, they were inferring that you could send someone home just because they were vulnerable, and they pulled that back, and then they posted something new, which you should go and look at the specifics of, because it would be hard for me to really repeat it. But it talks about a direct threat analysis and an accommodation analysis. It may be that if the employer is in an area that has a low occurrence of COVID-19 or a steeply dropping curve And there is a lot of protection in the workplace because everything is in place that should be in place. It may be that you cannot show there's a direct threat to that person, and you may need to bring them back to work. So it's very situational, and read the EOC guidance. My firm is also issuing an alert on this this afternoon that is a synopsis of the EOC guidance. And all of our alerts are archived on our website, so you can look at it there if you don't want to read the whole EEOC document, which is kind of long.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. Those are all the direct questions that we have.
John, I have a question, and it's probably somewhat commonsensical in terms of the answer. However, I have been talking to smaller companies that maybe just have 5 employees, one small location, and they really are not following a lot of these requirements. So now I'm thinking I need to be a little bit more direct with them in terms of my advice. But this has nothing to do with size of company, number of employees, right? These mandates, these wage laws, this is for all companies, 1 employee or more, correct?
The the health and safety type guidance, like the industry guidance I'm talking about, that is regardless of size. The wage and hour laws, like paying somebody to get their temperature checked, that's regardless of size. The only thing that might change is if with less than 5 employees, the discrimination laws may not apply, and so that might give a little more latitude in how to deal with employees, but it wouldn't change the requirements from a health standpoint. And by the way, hopefully this doesn't come off as political at all. The industry guidance documents are really well done, and they're clean, simple, common sense, and they include a checklist at the end that you could sit down with someone, Brennan, and just literally go through it, check, 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 and all the things that are required for all employers. And I think the checklists are all like around 2.5 pages long.
And to be clear, what site was that on?
This is all coming
Which
from
agency?
California.gov, which I realize is a big website. There's a lot more to it than that. If you, trying to think of the easiest way to find it, if you Google press release COVID-19, I would think the most recent press release would come up, and then these documents are all linked in the press release.
Great. I'll look for that. And just for those on the webinar, we'll end up posting that on our resources page on pandemic support, so you can find it there. And then, John, just also so you know, we have already posted Fisher Phillips' website on our resources page under pandemic support on our website, so it's there. And it is a wealth of information. Fisher Phillips has done an amazing job, which I'm sure you're a part of there as the committee pulling that together.
Oh, great. That's outstanding. Yeah. We have 89 lawyers on that task force who work 7 days a week to publish all that stuff. So thank you for putting it on there.
Yeah, and it's great stuff, and you can tell you have 89 lawyers doing it. So that's awesome. Yeah. So, John, we're trying to start and end these webinars on time. So thank you so much for your willingness to come out and volunteer your time and really share all of this information. I know we could probably sit here for another hour because I'm sure there's also more questions we all could ask. But that's the point of this webinar. So I just want to share with everybody, we're doing this every Friday for as long as it's needed. And every week we're going to have a different guest as a Q&A. Next week, we're going to have the Director of Environmental Health and Safety for ITT, who has oversight of 3,000 employees going in and out of the building. She's going to be sharing in more detail some of the things John just talked about. Unfortunately, or fortunately, how she looks at it, she's become an expert on infrared and thermal temperature checking, which she'd never do in her 20-plus year career. So she can share more about that as well. And so that'll be our next guest for our next webinar. The other thing we've done here too is, because there's been requests, we developed these tools as a do-it-yourself, meaning helping you to giving you the tools to help get organized. We've developed now some affordable packages where we can help you basically build out this plan so that if you don't have the time or bandwidth to do this, we can help you do it and help you get organized maybe more quickly than all the demands that are being put on your desk right now. So just want to make sure you're aware of that Bright Talent. All you have to do is just connect with us, and we're happy to talk to you about that. And so once again, John, thank you. And then I just want to thank everybody else for this webinar. And again, this will be uploaded probably in the next day or so to our website. So you can go back and listen to John's comments if you'd like. Hope everyone has a great rest of day and a great rest of weekend. Mickey Jo disappeared, so I hope she knows that we're ending the webinar now so she can turn it off. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.